Welcome to the Launch Capsule. With your host, James DuBos. Buckle up because your launch capsule begins now.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hey there, this is Jim DuBos, and thank you for joining me on another episode of the Launch Capsule. Today, we're talking about one of the most common post-deal conflicts out there, and that is the earnout. So first, let's define what is an earnout. An earnout is a additional financial incentive, and it's a performance incentive to help drive the company towards the return on investment that a buyer is looking for. Another way to think about this is it can be a bridge between the seller's goals and the buyer's goals. And so in my previous episode, I used a 20% or a $2 million earnout as a bridge, if you will, to get to the ultimate transaction value of $12 million. So a $10 million initial financial transaction and then a $2 million opportunity to contemplate. So here's some things to consider with earnouts. In my first transaction, I did a 24-month earnout, which was too long. I didn't know it at the time, but it was too long. And it was too long because post-transaction, the buyer has certain goals and objectives to integrate the company, to have different elements associated with the way the company is operated, which ultimately starts to conflict with the seller's goal, which is I want to keep my cost as low as possible. I'm going to focus on driving margin in every situation and opportunity. And you start to feel this tension between buyer and seller. And ultimately, goal conflict is the way I like to describe this, is one of the most common earnout issues associated. And so when you're negotiating the definitive purchase agreement, you're going to have a definition of what I refer to as adjusted margin or adjusted EBITDA. That is the basis of the earnout itself. And so what you're doing is in the DPA, you're defining how the earnout is calculated, what is included, what is not included, and what adjustments are allowed for you to get to your adjusted EBITDA, your adjusted margin. That is a typically the target should be based on a 12-month outcome. Now, I would encourage you to work towards a tiered earnout, meaning you have a certain dollar amount that you must hit for the earnout to be considered. And then you have tiers, maybe 25%, 50%, 100%, based upon the characteristics of the earnout. So if you have a $2 million, let's just use this as a number, as an example. Say a $2 million number was based upon $3 million of operating margin, just as an example. Well, if you hit 2.7 million, maybe that's your floor. Maybe if you hit 2.85, you get 25%. You hit 2.9, you get 50%. You hit the whole 3 million, you get your 100%. The reason I say that is because many times entrepreneurs will miss any of their earnout, basically get as my dad would say, an Indian nickel, zero, and they're frustrated because maybe they missed it by $100,000. Maybe the goal was 3 million and they generated 2.9, but they got zero of their earnout. And so I would encourage you to contemplate thinking about your earnout in terms of, can I create a tiered structure that accomplishes the minimum floor that the buyer wants, but at the same time, there's I'll say a little flexibility in the amount of the payment of the earnout based upon a tiered ramp, if you will. The other thing to think about is, when is it necessary to walk away? And every deal is different, but I can say that when you look at your past performance, don't set your earnout at a level that is outside of your typical past performance. So again, as an example, if your prior years demonstrate you're driving a 30%, EBITDA or gross operating margin in the business, and the buyer wants to set the operating margin at 35%, well, that's not realistic. You've never done that before in the prior 3 years. Why would they think you're going to get to that number now? And so those are kind of walk-away characteristics, to where you're saying the buyer is setting unreasonable expectations. Now, sometimes you can use adjustments to help you achieve, or let's say overachieve, to get to a target for your earnout. But again, there's going to be cases where you'll look and you'll go, this is a walk-away characteristic, because you're asking me to accomplish something that I've never done before. And so it's just being very practical and pragmatic about this process. One of my good friends and I were talking one day about business exits, and I described it this way. When you walk into a car lot, if you aren't willing to walk away, then you're going to pay whatever it takes to get that car. And so the dealer kind of has you where they want you, and they're never going to get to the number that you ultimately wanted to pay for the car. But if you walk into the transaction with, I'm willing to walk away based upon X, and look, I've done it. It's hard, right? It's difficult to walk away from a letter of intent that's a multi-million-dollar letter of intent, but now all of a sudden it's got characteristics that you just can't accept. It's tough, but you got to be willing to say no. If you're unwilling to say no, you're going to say yes to a deal that ultimately is not a good deal. So this is where the metal's going to, hit the road, so to speak, right? You have to be willing to walk away if you're being presented with characteristics that you don't think are achievable. Okay. And I'll just say, in many cases, entrepreneurs are accepting terms and conditions, particularly around the earnout, and they're based on characteristics that they could never accomplish in the business to begin with. And so they end up feeling a little, disappointed, but it was their own fault, because you accepted terms and conditions that you shouldn't have. You should have said no. Because many times the buyers are simply putting something out there to say, let's just see if they say yes. If they say yes, this is awesome, right? We don't think they're going to get to the number. But if you say no, and you're being reasonable, you're being realistic, and you present back to the buyer what you feel like is achievable based upon your past characteristics, that's a win-win. That's a win-win for both parties. So look, I hope this was helpful to you. We're going to continue on this journey of talking about the financial impacts and certain characteristics in deals, and I look forward to continuing this with you. Have an awesome day.
That's a wrap for today's episode of The Launch Capsule. With your host and mentor to success, James DuBos. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and share.